area of use of language, and I had you read in Zook, pages 98 to 122. The question of the place of the original languages comes up. How important are they? What I would say about that is that using a good English text, you can get 95, 98, 99% of what is being taught. If you understand English grammar well. That's one of the keys. But good English texts that are good translations follow the rules of English grammar as it relates to the Greek or the Hebrew or the Aramaic. And so you can get every major doctrine clear and all that. But there are some limitations. There are some limitations to the English text. And so the limitation is that, like any language, there's not a one-to-one correspondence in meaning. And both for Greek and Hebrew, there are idioms and there are ways of saying things, and there are concepts that just simply won't come over. I used to not believe this, but the more that I've studied Greek and the more I've read through the New Testament, the more I've realized that, again, no major doctrine is affected by my English text, but often I miss some of the nuances. And actually, in studying a passage, if you know the original languages, it's a whole lot easier to see the stuff. You will see the repetition. You will see a lot of these literary devices going on because it's very obvious in the original language, whereas in a lot of English translations, when you bring it over to the English, you lose those key words, those constructions that become clues to the text meaning. So there is a good, a legitimate place for the original languages, and that's one of the reasons why we as a school emphasize taking the original languages. And not just taking them so that you recognize them, but continuing to work in them until you become fluent in them, until you can use it effectively as a study tool. Because ideally, in message preparation, even for a Bible study, to be able to consult the original text and see some of these things that can be found will be more helpful in communicating it clearly. Now again, a person can preach and can teach adequately from the English text. And in reality, when I do sermon preparation myself, I work out of the English text. I don't do it as I was taught in seminary, which is you first translate the whole thing, and then you do an exegetical outline, and then you do a homiletical outline, and all that. I have found that I do homiletical outlines, I do exegetical outlines, I consult the original languages, I do those study elements using the original languages. I even open up the text to the original language passage and look at it, but ultimately I build around an English text because of the nature of the size of material I normally preach from. And but I still use the original language to really understand it well. So there is a place for it. Now, let's talk about lexical and syntactical analysis. What I mean by that. Lexical syntactical analysis is where you study the meanings of words. That's lexicography. Whenever you're analyzing a passage and you do a lexical syntactical analysis, the lexicon is your dictionary, gives you the meaning of the words. So you study the meanings of the words, and then you study their syntax within the sentence. Think of it this way. A sentence gets tacked together by certain things. That's syntax. How a sentence is put together. And when you study the original languages, it's much more helpful because, for example, in Greek you have nominative case nouns that tells you it's the subject of the sentence. Accusative case nouns that tells you it's the direct object of the verb. You have different kinds of verbs that tells you what's going on with the verb. You have participles and infinitives and all kinds of different kinds of words that have functions within the sentence that guide you. English, we have the same thing. And again, a good English translation takes those functions and converts them over into English structures. And so we pay attention to where things are and the diagramming of the sentences and things like that. Now, the basic presupposition behind a lexical-syntactical analysis is that words have a range of meanings. But when you put them within a context, whether it's a sentence, the way the sentence is structured, or a paragraph, larger unit, its range of meaning gets narrowed down to a specific use. So, an example we always use is the word trunk. That's a favorite one because you have the trunk of an elephant, you've got a trunk of a tree, you've got a trunk of a car, you've got the trunk of a telephone line, so you've got a trunk of a train line. So trunk has many different uses depending on its context and how it lands in a sentence. And it has a lexical meaning of this wide range of possibilities, but within the syntax, it can only mean one thing within the construction of the sentence it's in. And so that's what we're looking at. And in this, we're trying to go from a variety of meanings to the meaning. So why do we need it? Well, because if we don't do lexical-syntactical analysis of the passage we're studying, then we end up anywhere. That's the bottom line. You end up anywhere. And in fact, what you end up with is you get the Bible to say what you want to say. A lot of the heretical groups, that's what's going on. They're not doing good lexical-syntactical analysis. They're not looking at the range of meanings of the word and then looking at how it fits within that context. But I've seen evangelicals make the same mistake. They'll grab one meaning of a word and stick it everywhere, rather than seeing, even in the New Testament, even in the Old Testament, sometimes a word is used with several nuances, a range of meanings, sometimes even in the same paragraph. Jesus is notorious for doing this, using the same word with 2 or 3 different meanings. In fact, there's 1 or 2 places in the New Testament where you have the same word used, let's say, 3 times with either 2 or 3 separate meanings. And it's evident from the context. If you grab one of those meanings and put it across the board, it becomes gibberish. And so we do that. Now, I'd like to give you 7 steps to take when you're doing this kind of analysis. When you're trying to figure out the meaning of a sentence and all that, and first thing you want to do, the first step, is to identify the general literary form. Am I looking at prose? Am I looking at poetry? Is it wisdom literature? Is it history? Is it a parable? Recognize the form of the literature that it's occurring in, because that's going to guide you into the way sentences are structured. For example, if you're in Hebrew poetry, what would you expect to find as a major structural pattern? You'd expect to find parallelism. That's going to guide you into how you understand the sentences and the role of words in a sentence. But you're also going to expect to find things like words being cut out and words being used in an unusual way. In poetry, we look for those kinds of things. And so that's the kind of things. Identify the form. Second step, look at the context. Trace the theme and figure out, how does my passage, my verse, this word fit into its context. I recognize the kind of literature it's in, but I also look at the context. And context is always a key to avoiding error. Always look at context. And then identify the natural divisions of the text. And what I mean by that is, where are the section breaks? Where are the paragraph breaks? Where are the sentences? Phrases, clauses, depending on how far down you're breaking it down. In narrative literature, you're going to break it down to sentences and units, scenes. And in didactic literature, like Paul's epistles, you're going to break down sentences, sometimes down into their very phrases and clauses, because those become significant. And you want to see the relationships to one another. So depending on what kind of literature it is, you'll break it down into even smaller units at times. But I'm looking for the natural divisions, not the way I want to divide it, but how has the author structured things, divided things out. And then, the fourth step, look for connecting words. And tonight we're going to talk about textual connectives and the kind of words that connect stuff. Now, what a connective does, just to introduce you to the idea now, and we'll talk about it more again later, is a connective shows the relationship of one part of a unit of thought with another. Whether it's one part of a sentence with the other part of the sentence, or one part of a paragraph with the other part of a paragraph, or one part of a section. In other words, what's this paragraph's relationship with the one before it? What's my paragraph's relationship with the one after it? Often, there'll be a key connective, a word that tells me the relationship. And in a sentence, we have these things. The most common one that we use is the word and. And tells me that I've got two things that are the same, or that are being connected together equally. But tells me I've got two things that are being contrasted. And those are roles. So I'm looking for those kinds of words that'll guide me into showing me how my sentence is connected with the previous sentence or the following sentence, how my paragraph is connected with the previous one, the following one, and that helps me in understanding the context once again. It all goes back and forth. The fifth step is then you determine what individual words mean. And this is where you'll use your lexicon and your dictionary. And you look at and find what are the range of possible meanings, and then in this context, what is the most likely meaning of the word. Now, you have to be careful, though. Because as you do this, one of the things that you may do is to study the etymology of a word. If you're not familiar with that term, I think it's E-T-Y. Yeah. Etymology. And what the etymology of a word really is its historical roots. Where does the word come from? Now, Zook says some good things on this on pages 101 and 102. But here, and he has some good cautions, and let's go over some cautions. Whenever you study the history of a word, its original meaning and all that, do not equate its meaning with its history. Because the meaning changes. And you need to know what it meant at the time it was being written. So in the Old Testament, you want to know what that word meant at the time of that author. Because its meaning may have shifted even during the 1,000 years or 500 years that the Old Testament was written in. Same thing with the New Testament. It doesn't matter what the word meant 100 years earlier. The question is, what does it mean at that time? Using etymological studies often makes speakers sound very authoritative. And one of the favorite ones is, the church are the called out people of God, because it comes from the original ek kaleo. And ecclesia is made up of two words, ek and kaleo. And when the word originated, what you had was a situation where the town crier called out the people to come to a city meeting and vote on stuff, because it was Greek, and Greek had democratic city-states, and so they'd all come and they'd vote on things. And so they were considered the called out ones, the ecclesia, when they gathered to have their business meetings as a community and to vote on stuff. And so the church are the called out ones. Well, the problem is, in the first century, they didn't know about that. All they knew is that ecclesia meant a group of people standing on the side of the road yakking. Or it meant any kind of assembly of people anywhere. Whether it was a church, whether it was a picnic, whether it was a schoolhouse. Ecclesia was a very generic term that just meant any group of people that's gathered together to do something. As it was applied to the church then, it was applied to the church in contrast to synagogue, the Greek word for synagogue, which was a description of the Jewish gathering. And actually, synagogue, soon, together, goge, is from ago, to come, synagogue means to gather together. Again, it means the exact same thing as ecclesia. And it basically, both of them, ecclesia is a synonym with synagogue. The church chose ecclesia. The Jews called theirs synagogues. So there was a contrast there. But we need to be careful that we don't go back into the history and then take an earlier meaning and read it into that present time. Again, it sounds good. People will be impressed, but it may not be accurate. We want to know what it meant at the time that it was used. Another example of the danger of etymology of words is they talk about the deep significance of agape, the word for love, as opposed to phileo. Agape means committed love, phileo, friendship. Well, the reality is agape meant the same thing as phileo. They were synonyms. And phileo was falling out of use in the Greek language because it had come to be used for the word for kiss. And so now when you said you phileoed someone, it meant you kissed them. So they were less and less using that term to mean to love or the friendship love. And it has that nuance. And the term agape was a rarely used word until the first century. And in fact, it was used more and more in the Greek language and replaced phileo over the next century after the New Testament times. And I can take you through the New Testament text, and I can show you where it's used interchangeably. Because that's what was happening at that time. So, to make the distinction between phileo and agape is not as useful or as accurate as we often make it. You know, we talk about the four loves: agape, phileo. What were the other two? Sturge was one of them, which is the and eros. You know, the romantic love. Sturge is a mother's love for her child. You've got these four loves and all they're significant. Well, they did have those nuances. That is in the language, as it was used even in the first century, like in poetry and things like that. But it was still also basically a synonym. So we have to be careful when we start making those nuances. Now, when Jesus confronts Peter, 3 times he says, "Peter, do you love me?" You know, the first 2 times he says, "Do you agape me?" And Peter says, "No, I phileo you." The third time he says, "Do you phileo me?" And Peter said, "You know that I phileo you." I think there it is significant. There is a play on the nuances of the word. Because the text requires that the way it's structured. You know, the way it's done. There's got to be a reason why Jesus shifted that. It was not accidental. But in a lot of other instances, Jesus talks about God the Father agapeing him and God the Father phileoing him. So be careful about those things. Whenever you're doing one of these word studies, a good thing to do is to use a concordance and compare how the word's used in other literature. That's a hand, within both the New Testament and then the Old Testament. One of the useful things, again, about knowing the original languages, you can do concordance studies, let's say in the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. And that would allow you to see a word as it was translated from Hebrew into Greek, and then you can look at the Hebrew word that they translated that way and see how it's used as well.
What about using other texts outside the Bible from that historical period?
That's useful. In fact, Kittle's Theological Dictionary of New Testament Words, a 10-volume set, or if you get the 1-volume abridged Little Kittle as it's called, that's a handy tool that does that for you. And that is a good thing to do. If you get Lebronics and you have the, I think it's the Scholar's Edition or above, or the, I forget, they call it the Language Edition, they'll have Kittle's work in it. I don't remember if some of the other editions have, like the Student's Version, or the Bible Study Version as it's called. But it'll have it in it, and it'll do extensive word studies where he looked at all the extra biblical literature. And the great thing about Kittle is he listed everything he found up to that time. So you can look and see how the word is used in other literature. Much more has been found since. And that is a useful thing. But do these kind of comparative studies, and then also look at synonyms and antonyms. And ask the question, what are some antonyms? And do these antonyms show up in the text? What are synonyms? Do I see him using synonyms in the text? Or is he using the synonyms for stylistic reasons? Or is he dealing with the nuances of the difference in the meaning? For example, again, oida and gnosko are two words for know. Oida means intuitive knowledge, book learning. Gnosko means experiential knowledge, when that nuance is intended. Both just mean knowledge. They're synonyms. And there are cases where they're just simply used interchangeably. But there are also times when they're used with the nuance intended. But not every time. You have to look at context. I know in 1 John, John uses experiential knowledge, and Jesus uses gnosko, experiential knowledge, in his prayer in John 17. I believe with the nuance of experiential knowledge, not just head knowledge. And experiential knowledge in contrast, relational knowledge, maybe we could call it that, in contrast to just head knowledge. But he talks about God the Father knowing him with both oida and gnosko. So, true synonyms. So we look for synonyms, though, to understand them and to see why he used this one with this nuance rather than this one with that nuance. You can use lexicons and other tools to study the meaning within the culture at the time it was written. And that's a good thing to do. And again, Lebronics has some good lexicons in it, but there are others you can get. For example, BDB, Brown, Driver, and Briggs, a Hebrew and English lexicon of the Old Testament. That's a classic work, still very good. Gesenius, he does a Hebrew and Chaldee lexicon of the Old Testament. The guy's name is spelled this way. Oops. Gesenius. And another classic work, Bauer, Arndt, and Gingrich. They put together a thing that you often see it referred to as BAG. It's a Greek-English lexicon of the New Testament and other early Christian literature. And so that's another good tool, most of which ends up in Lebronics, which is why I would encourage you to get it and use it as a tool. There's Moulton and Milligan for those who have had Greek. There's Thayer. There's a lot of these works out there. Again, TD&T, the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament by Kittle, a classic work, expensive, 10 volumes. But you can get it, again, in Lebronics. And the reason I encourage you to do that is because then you can research it very quickly using that search program. Otherwise, you're pulling it off the shelf and flipping through it. And I've got my hard copy, and now I've got my Lebronics copy, and I use my Lebronics now. And there are some less technical works by, for example, Vine's Expository Dictionary of New Testament Words and Old Testament Words. Vine's is a less technical one. It's really aimed at the layperson who has not had Greek or Hebrew. And so it takes you through it more comfortably. There are other tools. As you build your language skills, you can use certain tools that compare, for example, cognate languages. And one of the ways that we're learning, especially in the Old Testament, we're learning the real meanings of Hebrew words that for years we wondered what they meant, was finding their parallel word in cognate languages. And what we mean by that is Hebrew is a sister language to Aramaic, Arabic, Ugaritic, Akkadian, some of the Canaanite dialects that's been found. All these different dialects from different areas that have been located, deciphered, and now they're beginning to compare. And what's been great about that is for a long time we had a lot of Hebrew words that we knew how it was spelled and we knew how it was pronounced. We had no clue as to what it was. And that's why I've seen the King James Bible criticized. One time someone said there's like 1,500 translational errors in the King James Bible. Well, that's because back then there were a bunch of words they had no clue what it was. And they knew it was some kind of bug, so they guessed. Or some kind of bird, so they took a guess. Or some kind of animal, so they had to pick one, so we'll pick that one. Sounds good. I mean, what do you do with that? for years and years and years, there was a word in the book of Samuel that no one had a clue as to what it was. And then it was finally discovered in an archaeological dig in a Canaanite city. And it turned out that the word pim referred to a coin that you used to pay. It was a half a shekel in value, and you used to pay the Philistines to sharpen your plows. And this pim was only used for 100 years in Philistine history. Now, the significance of that is that the author then of Samuel had to have lived within 100 years of that incident. He had to have lived at a time when you would know about that coin. So that pushes the date of the writing of Samuel right back there to the time period it's talking about. It's an eyewitness account of a lot of stuff. Or was it Samuel? No, it's Judges. I guess it was Judges. What is it? I can't remember. Samuel or Judges. But it puts it right there. So you look for these things in cognate languages so that you understand what they mean. One of my favorite ones is the Rose of Sharon. Did I mention that here last time? Yeah. In the King James Bible, they came across this word. They didn't know what it was, but they knew it was some kind of flower, and so they had to pick a flower. So roses are beautiful, so they made it to Rose of the Sharon Plains. Well, the Sharon Plains is actually a swamp in those days, and years later they found out that it was not a rose; it was a tulip. So the Rose of Sharon is really the tulip of Sharon. But if you get yourself any English translation, that's still called the Rose of Sharon. Now the reason is because if they were to translate tulip of Sharon, some little old lady would come hunting for them with her shotgun. How dare you violate the Word of God? Because it's such a part of our tradition. I mean, we got hymns based on the Rose of Sharon. But they now stick a little footnote that says, oh, by the way, it really is literally tulip. And we've got those all through our Bibles now because there are things that are traditional things to say, but the reality is it's something else. The book of James. King James wanted a book of the Bible named after him, so he had the book of Jacob changed to the book of James. And he had James, the brother of Jacob, the brother of John, and Jacob, the brother of Jesus, changed to James. Every other language calls him Jacob. But in English, it's James because you can't change it now. It's set in tradition. But in your Greek text, it'll be Jacob. So we have those things, and as we have improved, we have found them. Now, another thing to do when you're doing this analysis here, and this isn't the next step yet, but still under this last step is you look for the specific denotation intended by the author. And what I mean by that is a word has a range of meanings. The author's denotation is the one he wants it to have. So out of the 5 possible meanings, number 2 is his denotation. In other words, that's what the word is really pointing to. It's denoting it. Now, to figure out the denotation, you do things like see if the author explains the meaning of the word to you. Does he give you something in the text to give you the meaning of the word? And in a sentence, when you're trying to figure out the denotation of key words, let the subject explain the predicate, let the predicate explain the subject. Let the parts of the sentence help you figure out the denotation of those words. And then another thing you can do when you're trying to figure out what exactly does the author want the word to mean, look for parallel ideas. There are instances where he's clearly drawing a parallel that clarifies. And so, does he do that? Does he restate it another way that gives me a clear answer as to exactly which meaning this word has, or which one he wants it to be? Now, in doing that too, I look to see things like, is he using a figure of speech? And does he intend us to recognize that figure of speech? And does he intend us to understand the meaning behind the figure of speech? See, that's an important thing that I'm looking for. And something that can be helpful in figuring out the real sense of the word is looking at parallel passages that may explain it. For example, what does it really mean to be filled with the Spirit? Do not get drunk with wine, for that is dissipation, but be filled with the Spirit. Okay? What does being filled with the Spirit mean? Colossians 3:16 says, let the word of Christ richly dwell within you. And then both Ephesians 5:18 and Colossians 3:16 follow their commands with speaking to one another in psalms and hymns, spiritual songs, singing with thankfulness in your hearts to the Lord, and being subject to one another in fear of Christ, and da 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 da. Notice, they're almost word for word identical in terms of the effects of being filled with the Spirit or letting the word of Christ richly dwell within you. So, what does it mean to be filled with the Spirit? God's Word influencing my life, dwelling in me. God's Word being a critical element in my life. I cannot be a Spirit-filled Christian unless I'm living according to God's Word. Doesn't matter how good I feel. Doesn't matter how spiritual I feel. I can be a Spirit-filled Christian while I am consciously obeying God's Word and letting it guide my decisions, even if I feel lousy and unspiritual. So see, I look at parallel passages and they help me understand the meaning of a word and the nuance that is intended by that word. Now, let's ask this question. Can a word have more than one denotation? Or can it mean more than one thing? When? When would it mean more than one thing?
Well, when like, for example, Paul all the time uses a word, and he's using like a play on words almost. He'll sit there and he'll want you to get kind of a couple of different ideas out of this word that you can get from.
That's right. There's a literary device called a double entendre. A double entendre. It's from the French, double entendre. Means two intentions. Two intended meanings. And there are times when the author intends a word to mean two different things. Now, that is a literary device. But when the author intends it to mean two different things, he's going to give you textual clues to that end. Jesus loved to do this. For example, when he's talking to Nicodemus, he says, you must be born from above. No. He said, you must be born again. No. He said, you must be born from above. And in his discussion, he uses both meanings. So which one does he mean? Well, he means both. Because the Greek word he used means both. It can mean from above or it can mean again. And in his discussion with Nicodemus, he talks about a second birth. But he talks about how the fact that second birth comes from above. See? A double entendre. And that's why Nicodemus is going, huh? And of course, that's why Jesus, I think it's tongue-in-cheek. Nicodemus, are you the teacher of Israel and you don't get it? See, there's some little playing going on here. I think that's also why later on the disciples, like in the upper room, when Jesus says stuff, some of their comments, like when Jesus says, if you see me, you've seen the Father, and one of them says, well, in that case, just show us the Father. I think what's going on, they're not being obnoxious, saying, okay, I'll bite. I know you're playing with my mind. I know there's a trick to this thing. So, okay, I'll call your bluff. Show me the Father. And of course, then Jesus says, well, have you been with me so long and you don't recognize? And of course, Jesus set him up and goes on from that. He loved to do that. John does those things. I think the best classic example of John using a double entendre is in the prologue of the Gospel of John. He talks about how the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not katalabane it. And it's a Greek word that can mean conquer or overcome, or it can mean understand, comprehend. And then John develops both ideas through the gospel. The opponents of Jesus who are in the dark don't understand what he's saying. But the opponents of Jesus, who are in the dark, are trying to destroy and defeat him, and they fail. And so you have both ideas of that word, and the way it's used there in the prologue, you can't figure out which meaning he means. Because he doesn't want you to be able to figure it out until you've gone through the rest of the story. And so there can be a double denotation for a word when it's intended by the author. But that's the key. It has to be intended by the author. It's not just automatic. It's not just automatic. So, now, sixth step. Okay, the sixth step is after you've done all these things, you've now seen all these things, you looked at the context, and you've looked at the meaning of the word and its denotation, things like that. The sixth step is analyze the syntax. Now again, syntax involves how the sentence is structured, how the sentence is organized. Here, I'll get these out of the way. So I look at the syntax, and I want to know how it's put together, because different languages, express concepts different ways in sentences. For example, in Hebrew, there's a stress on word order. Okay, and in Greek, they use inflected words to tell you what's going on, and there's not so much of a stress on word order. In English, what's the stress on? Word order. We're like Hebrew. But in Greek, you can move a word around. Now, you move a word around for emphasis. But to understand the sentence, you look for the case and the gender, and you look for the verb and its person and number and things like that. They have other textual clues that guide them. So Greek is more like Spanish in how it does things. Whereas English and Hebrew are more alike in that. So you look at these and you look at the syntax and it guides you. So in Greek, when I really want to know what the big issue is in this sentence or in this paragraph, I look for something that's been put out of place. And Jesus did this a lot of times. The word he's emphasizing, the subject of the sentence may end up as the very last word. The verb may be at the very end. Or the direct object of the verb may be at the very beginning of the word in front of the subject. You can do those things, but when I'm analyzing it, I note what each word's role is supposed to be and where it's located. And that tells me, pay attention to this. This must be an important element in the thought process. He's wanting me to notice it. In Greek, when they really want to emphasize something, sometimes they'll include the be verb, the verb for to be. Because in Greek it's not necessary. That's a word that can always be dropped out. So when it's included, it's significant. Same thing when they stick in certain pronouns that aren't needed, but they stick it in anyway. That tells me, pay attention. This is important. For John in 1 John, one of the most important things to do is to pay attention to pronouns. And in fact, in Jesus' conversations, one of the most key things in interpreting the significance of what Jesus says to Nicodemus, to the royal official, to all these different people, is who he's addressing. Is it singular or plural? What pronouns does he use? There's a couple of places where he uses the masculine pronoun to refer to the Holy Spirit. Very significant. And so we see those things. A helpful thing to do when you use the English text is use interlinear text. Use several English texts, because that will help you see some of these things. Because the different translators, as they're dealing with these things, they'll nuance it a certain way to try to reflect what they see as some of these nuances within the language, within the syntax. And so, again, looking at them and comparing them, you can catch some of these ideas there. But recognize this. There are limitations to grammar and syntax. Moise Silva has a great thing to say about it. He's a guy whose specialty is in hermeneutics. He's reformed in his theology, so he's the opposite, in many ways opposite to what I would take. I'm a dispensationalist in my hermeneutic, he's reformed in his hermeneutic, he uses the Westminster Confession to determine the meaning of a passage. And he does it openly. I mean, he admits to it. But he says a very good thing. He says, grammar is at best a secondary support to the interpretation of a passage. After you've done all this, realize that. Grammar is at best a secondary support. However, if a proposed meaning cannot be established apart from an appeal to a grammatical subtlety, chances are that the argument is worthless. The biblical writers were clear and explicit and did not expect their readers to have to decipher complicated linguistic riddles. Now, what he means by this is, if I'm looking at the grammar and the syntax and all this kind of stuff, and my interpretation hangs on a tertiary use of that grammatical form, odds are the original audience would have never caught it. Odds are it ain't what was intended. If my doctrine depends on that nuance of that grammatical turn, there's probably something wrong with my doctrine. If it's an important doctrine, God's going to have it repeated several places and made very clear. And so I don't need to resort to that. Okay, step 7. Last step here. After you've done all these things, then rephrase your results in normal layman's terms. Remove all the technical jargon. Because what's going to happen is you're reading all these different tools, these lexicons, all this kind of stuff. They use a lot of technical jargon. And it's easy to use this stuff because you begin to think in those categories. One of your challenges as you take more and more seminary classes and take theology and all this kind of stuff, and you start reading all this stuff, you begin to learn the terminology, and there's a tendency to use the terminology because now you know it. But when you're teaching normal people, as I like to call them, they're not going to understand it, and it'll go right over their heads. So learn to translate all your studies back into regular English. And I don't know if you've noticed, but I try to do that as I teach. I try to use real normal English stuff, although I'll give you terms, but I'll define them. But then I try to define them in terms of normal English. Because our real goal in studying these passages and then in teaching them is to communicate God's truth. And we don't want to go over people's head. Now, some people aren't capable of that. One time when I was in seminary, we had a student intern at my church who got up and preached a couple sermons. And he was very flowery. Wonderful, just flowing words from him. 4 syllables, 5 syllables, 6 syllables. Humongous words. And you had to sit there and just, okay, let me think. Can I follow this sentence? You know, it's one of those things where I know the meaning of every word, but I can't figure out what the sentence means. And after it's over, the compliments he got, oh man, he's such a beautiful speaker. I didn't understand a thing he said, but it was really great. I mean, that's what they were saying. And I thought, well, what's wrong with this guy? Well, I found out, because then his 5-year-old child walked up to him, and he was having a conversation with his 5-year-old child using 4 and 5 and 6 syllable words. The guy couldn't speak except in 4 and 5 and 6 syllables, and the poor kid's going, and he's lost, just like the rest of us. Don't be that way. Learn how to simplify things and take your data and make it understandable. That's a key to the success in doing this kind of linguistic analysis. So when you're studying a passage and you're breaking it down, follow these principles. But always end up restating it in clear terms. Okay, let's talk about interpreting narrative literature. We'll switch and move on to this idea before we take a break. Now, in this lecture, I'm going to be focusing primarily on the views of someone named Walter Kaiser, who is a dispensationalist and takes a literal, grammatical, historical approach to the Scriptures, and including narrative literature. He's one of the leading authorities in this area. Now, narrative literature in the Bible includes Genesis through how far in the Old Testament? All the way to Esther. Yeah, Job is wisdom literature. It goes from Genesis to Esther in the Old Testament, from Matthew to Acts in the New Testament. It represents, it seems like at least half of the Bible. It's a whole lot. Now, narrative, even though they are historical, and often they're biographical in nature, their purpose is neither. Narrative literature is neither history nor is it biography. Though it contains historical references and is based on history, and though it is non-fiction, it's not fiction, it's real history, but it's not intended to be a history book. Same thing. It contains biographical elements to it, but it's not intended to be biographies. It's written as literature. It reflects the creativity, the personality, the purposes of its author, but it's really ultimately theological. Narrative literature, especially Old Testament narrative, is all about what God is doing. That's really the central focus of narrative literature. It's not Abraham. It's not David. It's not Samson. It's God as He's interacting in and through these people and with these people. God is always really the subject behind it. And that's why when it looks at history, it looks at history from God's perspective, not from man's. And it talks about the divine perspective on things. Why it happened. Kings and Chronicles is a great example of that. It goes to these different kings and the things they did, right and wrong and all this, and how God blessed and God did. But the real focus is, in the book of Kings, is that God keeps His covenant promises. And that He told Israel, if you obey me, I'll bless you. If you don't, I'll punish you. And the whole point of the book of Kings is not to give you an account of each of the kings and how they messed up or did good, but to give you an account of how God interacted with the nation through those individuals, and how God was sovereignly in control of their history. So the whole point of it is not to give you every detail of the king's rule, but the highlights that show you God's involvement. So it's a divine perspective. Now, at the same time, though, that doesn't make it non-historical. It's different from Michener's historical fictions. All the people there were real people. All the incidences really happened that way. It wasn't manipulated. It wasn't changed. You know, some historiographers today believe that we could really manipulate history. A good example is that in recent years, there was in, I think it's high school history books, a picture of a little black girl standing on the steps of a school with some state troopers standing behind her. And a caption on it talked about how the state government was keeping the blacks from going to school with the whites. When in reality, the state troopers were there to protect her so she could go in and go to school. The very opposite. And if you go to older history books, they had the right caption. But that history book, they rewrote history for their political agenda. See, that's not the way the Bible does it. When it reports in narrative literature a historical event, it really did happen that way. And it happened for those reasons, because God was behind the scene making it happen for those reasons. So there's a difference. Well, let's talk about some of the literary devices used by the authors in writing narrative literature. These are the kinds of things to look for. Again, these will help you get the meaning of the text. Because what we want to accomplish when we study a passage is to know, what did the author want his readers to get out of this text? What was the teaching point of the author to his readers? Not what will work good for my message. Not what will sound good. Not what will tickle the ears of my congregation because it will make them feel better. But what did the author intend to teach? And I'll just express my complaint here. Most preaching that I've seen done out of narrative literature, I would categorize as operating in the area of significance. You remember what significance is? It's not the meaning of the text, it's an application from the meaning. And they'll take an area of significance and make it the meaning of the text. Or they'll do something like, they will take a passage and they'll grab an idea out of that passage and they'll make it the point of the passage. And they'll completely miss what is really going on. My favorite illustration of this is one day in a church I was in, one of the staff was called on to preach. And he got up and preached a sermon. And afterward, the vast majority of the people in the congregation were just amazed. They were just very impressed. He was an eloquent speaker. And his message really flowed. He had great illustrations and stories. He was preaching from 1 Samuel chapter 17. David and Goliath. And here's the point of his passage. That we all have fears like Goliath. But if we have faith in God, we can conquer those fears just like David conquered his fear when he faced Goliath. Now, if you've studied the passage, you realize one of the main points of the passage is the fact that David had no fear. He wasn't afraid of Goliath. In contrast to Saul, who was scared silly. Saul, and there's a contrast between David and Saul in this passage. And the point of the passage is because God was behind David and David was God's anointed, David could face Israel's opponents, and you see David's character in that he sees an issue not of a giant, but an issue of this giant is insulting my God, and because of that, this guy doesn't have a prayer of a chance. And when others are afraid and says, how can you take him on, you wimpy little kid? David says, well, I've killed lions and bears. What's the big deal? A lion came and I grabbed it by the beard and knocked it on the head. So, this guy's just a little bit bigger target. David's attitude is completely, it's the opposite of what the sermon was. It's a great psychological study. Completely disconnected from the text. Does not carry the weight of thus saith the Lord. It was not what God intended to be taught from that passage. It was a complete waste of everybody's time. And only 2 or 3 people picked up on that. Came to me and said, you're an expert in this area. Where was that in the text? And I had to say, well, I'm sorry, but you weren't. But most, they say, oh, isn't he wonderful? And I have to smile and say, well, he did a good job of speaking. Had to be diplomatic about it.
So that's a bad literary device. That'd be a bad literary device.
That's right. Well, that would be very, very bad because he didn't pay attention to the literary devices. He had a philosophical, psychological agenda, and he was preaching a feel-good sermon. Felt need sermon. And a lot of people do that. They try to perceive what the needs of the congregation are. Now let me find a verse and preach about it. And that's the danger. You don't just pick a verse and run from there. I used to call it that. I grew up with preachers who did that. They read off a verse and then they start preaching and never get back to it. And they had their agenda. Now, in most cases, what they said wasn't wrong. There was some Bible verse somewhere that said it. But it wasn't what the passage said. So the great thing is you didn't have to bring your Bible because you knew he wasn't going to talk about it anyway. It's a real problem. And sometimes people can be very impressed by that. And big-time Bible teachers do it all the time. A good example of this is I used to follow a guy named R.B. Thiem. And I listened to a bunch of his tapes when I was in college, and he's a well-known Bible teacher, now retired, down in the Houston area. And his followers are known as tapers because they listen to his tapes. And his church had a ministry where they would send you the tapes for free. And every week his sermon would be sent out and people would listen to him. Well, in doing this, as I listened and as I studied the Bible, I began to notice that often he would preach a sermon, especially out of the Old Testament. He'd preach a sermon from a passage, and everything he said was true, but not connected to the passage. It was not the meaning of the passage. And you look at it and you go, how did he get that out of there? And at first, when I first read it, I was really amazed. Oh, this guy must really know the Word of God to be able to see those things, because I can't see them. But after a while, I stopped and thought one day and said, I think the reason I can't see it is because it's not there. And then began paying attention, and sure enough. And often what he was doing is he was going to this, and the things he was saying were good, but they were not the passage. And that's a real danger, because that does not carry the weight of thus saith the Lord. That becomes thus saith me. But people become dependent on someone like that, because if they can't figure out where it comes from, then they say, well, I'm going to have to let him tell me what it means, because I certainly can't figure this out myself. And so one of the side effects of that style of teaching was that a lot of dependent people. And by the way, I've met a lot of guys who were saved through his ministry and who grew spiritually through his ministry and have gone on to serve the Lord very faithfully. He's accomplished a lot of good things. There's weaknesses with the man, but he has, I've met a lot of his people. Now, most of them have departed from him in the sense that they went on and began studying the Scriptures on their own and were no longer dependent on him to tell them what to think. And one of the weaknesses of many of his followers, I'm not saying him, but many of his followers, is that they're looking for someone to tell them what to think. I've seen this with several big-time Bible teachers. One of my complaints about followers of Bill Gothard is many of them, not all of them, but many of them, when I try to have fellowship with them and you start to talk about Bible or theology, it's wait, let me pull out my manual and see what I think. No, they're not thinking on their own, they're waiting for Bill Gothard to tell them what to believe. We should never do that with anybody. We should be looking to the Scriptures to tell us what to believe. We consult others to test our understanding and ideas. But we should never need to be dependent on anyone. And we should not follow them blindly, because everyone errs somewhere. Okay? Except me, of course. No. And, we all do. And we're blind to our errors. One of the things that I have loved about teaching is that every year, just about every year, some student raises their hand and says, Dr. Derickson, what about this verse? When I've said something. Or, why does it mean that? Why doesn't it mean this? And I've said, well, because my teachers in seminary told me that this is what it means, so they obviously know what they're talking about, don't they? I'll check it out, and I'll tell you next class. And I come back to next class and say, I was wrong. It really does mean something else. And sometimes it's missing, the obvious is just stare. As soon as they put their little finger on it, go, what about this word here? It's like, I've been looking at this for years and not seeing the obvious. But I learned from that. We all will make these mistakes. In studying the Scriptures and teaching it, don't be intimidated by that. Some people think, I can't teach it until I have 100% correct. Well, then none of us will ever get to teach. Be as faithful as you can to the text and realize that there are going to be times when you eat humble pie and say, I was wrong. And be open to that. Let Scripture become the authority in your life. So, that's something to be aware of. Well, let's talk about some of these literary devices. And the first literary device to look for in narrative literature, this is unique to narrative literature, is the author's use of scenes. The author's use of scenes. We see this in television. One of the prime examples of scenes is if you've seen the Law and Order program. How do you know they're shifting from one scene to the next? The sound. Bum, bum. And there's several shows like that I've noticed that have started doing that. That makes me wonder if that's just a a really cool device, or if American television viewers are getting that slow. Yeah, you know, we have different ways. Well, in the Bible, authors use scenes. The scenes usually involve two characters, whether it's two individuals or two groups or an individual in a group, but there's usually two players of some sort. God may be one of them, like, for example, God and Moses, you know, or Moses and Aaron, or God with Aaron versus Miriam. So you have all these different scenes. But usually there's two characters, and in all the scenes in narrative literature, one of the things to pay attention to is the presence of God. Where is God in this scene? Now, He's not always speaking, He's not always visible, but He's behind the scenes, and one of the things we're paying attention to is, where is God in all this? You know, in the story of Jonathan's attack on the Philistine garrison. Well, where is God? Comes right out of the mouth of Jonathan. You know, perhaps the Lord will give us the victory. You know, his armor bearer says, well, you know, how are we going to do this? He says, well, if when we're climbing up the hillside, they tell us to come up to them, we know we're going to win. If we're climbing up and they come down to us, then we know we're going to lose. But we'll give them a good fight anyway. And so they're climbing up. And this hillside they're climbing up is like this. It's a mere cliff. And the Philistine says, come on up. And Jonathan says, ooh, it's hunting season. And he goes to him like he's plowing a field. Knocking him down, and his armor bearer, who doesn't own a sword, he's probably only got a spear, is finishing him off. Beep, 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 beep. And of course, the whole battle pursues from that. But where is God in this? God is giving them the victory. Two men, poorly armed, do not take on a battalion and win. The only time we have small groups do that, they're called the Navy SEALs. But they aren't poorly armed, and they're not moderately trained. I don't know if you're familiar with the story. In the Grenada invasion, we had to rescue the governor of the island of Grenada, who was British. And he was being guarded by a Cuban battalion of infantry. And we sent in a SEAL team of 6 men. It took them 3 tries before they rescued him. And so they, in the briefing afterwards, they asked him, well, why did it take you 3 times to rescue him? No casualties on the SEAL's part, by the way. And the guy says, well, if we'd had a 7th guy, we could have done it the first time. Okay. But in Jonathan's case, God is behind the scenes. So in looking at the author's use of scenes, one of the things the author is doing is letting you get a glimpse of where God is on these things. So pay attention to those things. And when you're looking at the author's use of scenes, summarize its contents. What is going on? And recognize the beginning and the ending of that scene. Because in narrative literature, you break it up into scenes, just like we do for movies and for plays and for television shows. Because we work by that. Our minds work by that. Scene after scene after scene. And they can be short scenes, they can be long scenes, and things like that. The scene can move its location. For example, in Numbers chapter 12, when Aaron and Miriam oppose Moses because he's marrying the Ethiopian woman. It moves from the camp, where they're working him over, big sister's chewing out little brother. Who cares if he's 80 years old? You know, you're still my little brother. And you can't do this. I didn't give you permission. I'm in charge of the family. I'm the big sister. You know, it's one of these kind of things. And then it moves to the tent of meeting, where God says, come here. And then all of a sudden now you're there, and God's talking to them and saying, how dare you treat my prophet that way? You know, regular prophets like y'all, I just communicate with visions and dreams. But not so with Moses. I speak to him face to face, and you dare oppose him? I mean, that's really, I think, possibly even the tone of voice. It's like, you know, how stupid can you be? And then, of course, God strikes her with leprosy as punishment. But you have this movement from place to place. He doesn't detail the long walk there and all the argument that continued. Or maybe it was the feeling of dread. when God says, come here, and they're going, what next? But notice those things. So that's the first thing to pay attention to. And then the second thing as a literary device is the author's point of view. The author's point of view. He often places the point he wishes to make in the form of a question or a speech from someone's mouth. What is the author's perspective on what's going on here? Does someone say something significant that tells me what the author is seeing or wants me to see? You can identify this from the climax of a scene or of a story. You can realize the author's point of view. The scene, and the climax would be the one scene that sort of brings all the others to an end and brings resolution. They may have a scene that follows, but there is the real central point. Now, what's the ultimate value of determining the point of view? It keeps us from going with just the surface lessons. Again, see, when I go to 1 Samuel chapter 17, David and Goliath, and I want to know, what does the author of Samuel want me to get out of this scene, out of this event? And David's victory over Goliath. What is the important point he's making here about God's work in Israel? Where is God in this? Well, God is the sovereign king of Israel who operates his kingdom through the intermediary of first Samuel the prophet, then Saul the king, and now he's replacing Saul, because he's the real king. He's replacing Saul with a new king, David, and he's with David because his spirit has come upon him, and he's showing the whole nation that David is the man who ought to be leading them. See, God is accomplishing these kinds of things through David, and David is a man of faith who has absolute trust in God and is so loyal to God, he'll kill any giant who insults his God. See, you have that going on there, and so you need to then, as you study the passage, see what's going on, not something about how to deal with fear. See, that's a secondary issue. So recognizing the author's perspective helps you avoid getting off on a rabbit trail and making that the central focus. Now, again, it doesn't stop you from saying, here's a secondary issue in the passage. Look at how these people were afraid of him, but David wasn't. What's the difference between the two? David trusted God, they didn't. That's a legitimate statement to make. That's a legitimate observation to make. And you can say, and as an application of that observation, although it's not the point of the author, something we can say is, it's a good thing for us because other passages of Scripture teaches that we need to trust God in times of adversity. And so we see that truth that's taught directly elsewhere illustrated here. So it's an illustration of a truth that's taught elsewhere in Scripture, that I can use it that way. But it should not be my central point from that passage. Now, having said that though, I have seen well done where a pastor or a speaker will want to speak on an issue that is a secondary issue in a passage. And what he does is he says, now let me first tell you what the main point of the passage is. Here's what it is. Ding, ding, ding. But a secondary issue in the passage is this idea here. And I want to talk about this idea. But understand that it's in the context of knowing that the author intended to talk about this point over here. But let's talk about this. That's a legitimate thing to do because then you're speaking in the area of significance. But you have done your homework and you know what the real meaning is, and you know how this relates to the real meaning. See, that's okay. That's okay. But when you have the author's viewpoint, that helps you in that. It keeps you from getting off on a rabbit trail. Another thing to look at, the third thing as a literary device to pay close attention to in narrative literature is the use of dialogue. The author's use of dialogue. Key concepts comes out of the mouths of individuals. And so you pay attention. For example, in Numbers 12:2 and verses 6 through 8, you have Aaron and Miriam's words. Then God's word. And again, the point is, Moses is God's chosen leader. And in Numbers, you have this occur several places where God reaffirms Moses as his chosen leader, Aaron as his chosen priest. Those are some key themes. So what's the role of the dialogue there? It carries the theme forward. It carries the theme that he's developing, but it also sometimes they'll use dialogue to summarize a story. Someone says something that gives you a good summary of what's happened. Or they'll say something that presents their character. It sets the stage so you recognize the role this person plays or the character of this person. A good example is you might ask the question, was Joab a righteous man or an unrighteous man? Because he murders at least a couple of people. So, was Joab a believer? Or was he unregenerate? Well, I can take you to places where, there's one place where he clearly, what he says, only a believer would say about God. In fact, his challenge to David is to give God the glory. You know, so you go, well, what is with Joab? Well, he's a very complex person in the book of Samuel. He's not a simple guy. But he's a foil that shows David's weaknesses. And he is a very flawed man himself, though a powerful warrior. But it's the things that comes out of his mouth that gives you key clues as to his character. And so, dialogue is very significant. Now, within this area of dialogue, there's a thing called stylized speech. Now, what stylized speech is where you have one character says something, and another character says it almost word for word. And sometimes it is word for word. It'll be said repeatedly, over and over, word for word. That's one of those little blinking lights. Pay attention to what's being said. But in stylized speech, very often, in fact most often, the second statement either adds to or takes away from the first one. And that's where you go, bing! Pay attention. This is important. Okay? It can be very slight changes, but they're very significant. For example, God tells Elijah, anoint Elijah as your replacement. Okay? And anoint, who else? He had 3 people to anoint. Elijah, Jehu to wipe out Jezebel and Ahab's descendants, and then Hazael to kill Ben-Hadad. Ahab was supposed to kill Ben-Hadad. He didn't. He made a treaty with him instead. So God says, I still want Ben-Hadad dead. Well, Elijah does anoint Elisha and gives him these tasks. But Elisha is the one who ultimately anoints Hazael. And then he sends one of his assistant prophets to anoint Jehu. And he tells the guy, he gives him a very short statement to make. You know, God has anointed you king of Israel. He's supposed to say that, pour the oil on his head, and run. The guy gets there, and he says, God has anointed you king of Israel, and you shall wipe out Ahab and Jezebel's descendants and kill them all. Points and runs. He adds some stuff to it. And what does Jehu do? He goes and wipes out all those people and purges them, and God rewards them with 4 generations. And, oh well. Someone's playing with a dumpster, I guess. But he rewards them with 4 generations. But you had this added. That's something that is significant to note. So, a narrative device is this stylized speech. Now, in stylized speech also, they'll do things like summarize what's happened or introduce the next major movement with a summary statement by someone making a statement. And so this would be a case where he uses this speech to carry the narrative forward. And by doing that then to advance the message as you go along. Okay, now, there are lots of rhetorical devices that an author uses, and I just like to point out some of the key ones. These rhetorical devices are used in narrative, again, to give you information. And one of the most common rhetorical devices in narrative literature is repetition. Repetition. The repetition of words, phrases, sentences, and even events. Repetition is a key element within narrative literature that ties things together. And you can have this different ways. Matthew marks off his sections of the gospel with the statement, when Jesus had finished this, then something happened. There's 5 times he says that. In Judges, in the book of Judges, what's the key phrase? Second half of the book. It introduces it, it ends it, and in the middle. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. See, it's repeated over and over and over. And then he goes through the sewer of their society. You know, the 2 stories of the Danites stealing the idol and conquering Laish and going into idolatry, and the story of the Levite's concubine being raped to death in the Benjamite War. You just see the moral decay that they had fallen into. But those key terms puts that section together, and it tells you, why was this written? So you realize, well, we have a king now. Why God let us have a king? Because things got so bad, somebody had to be in charge to straighten out this mess. It's an interesting thing that you often don't realize is the story of Ruth occurs right in the middle of that sewer. And Boaz is a real contrast to the kind of people that's all around him. It's a wonderful contrast, because Ruth is written in the context of the time of the Judges, when Israel was just spiraling down into moral decay. And then you have someone like Ruth comes along and ends up being a righteous Moabite who is helped by God sovereignly through the righteous Judean, Boaz. A righteous man. And again, there's a good example in narrative literature. How do you know Boaz is a righteous man? The very first words out of his mouth are a blessing from God. That's a literary device in narrative literature that tells you his character by the very first words that he says. See, those are the things. In Genesis, there's a phrase, these are the generations, the Toledotes. You've got a whole slew of these, which goes, and then it's followed by the history of the descendants of that individual. So these things can be repeated, and they tie things together. You can have what's called resumptive repetition. That's where you take, they go through and they start explaining some things, and then they take the reader back to the beginning point to continue the story after the explanation. And so that's where, they sort of took a rabbit trail off the narrative, and so they come back to the narrative and go back. A good example of this is Michal helps David escape. And then there's a discussion of Michal's experience, that her dad took her and gave her to another guy, and she ended up being married to somebody else and hauled off. And then it goes back to David's escape and continues the story of David running away. So that it uses resumptive repetition to bring you back to that. Okay, so again, it's the same repetition kind of rhetorical device. Another rhetorical device used by authors in narrative literature is a thing called inclusion, or an inclusio. Now, what an inclusion is, it's a repetition of a word, a phrase, or a concept at the beginning and the end of a section. Think of it as a bookend. And it tells me that everything in between is related to each other, at least, if not to the inclusion itself. So this inclusion is used to tie things together. Now, can you think of an example of inclusions in the Bible? In some narrative literature? Words or phrases that are repeated? I'll give you a hint. Right? Huh?
I don't know the phrase, but it's like the blessed.
Yeah, those are repeat. For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the pure. What is it? Blessed are the. I'm going to blank on it. The Beatitudes begins with and ends with, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. That's right. And he uses repetition, blessed, 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 throughout the thing. But you got this statement, theirs is the kingdom of heaven, at the beginning and the end. So what Jesus is saying by that is, this is what a citizen of the kingdom looks like. Right here. And another inclusion in that same section is Jesus' a statement that the law and the prophets. I did not come to destroy the law and the prophets at the beginning. And he ends by saying, this is the law and the prophets, after he's made a commentary on the law and the prophets. And so that forms an inclusion that says all this section is related. I'm talking about the same subject all the way through here as it relates to the law and the prophets. So inclusion is a favorite device. Again, in Judges, it was the statement, in those days there was no king. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. In the book of Judges, that forms this inclusion that locks those things together. So those are good examples of both repetition and then in inclusion. Another favorite literary device is the chiasm. The chiasm. And I'll spell that for you. Yeah. The chiasm. This is a literary device that follows a pattern of, let's say, A, B, C, B prime, A prime. And it can be simple, it can be complex, it can be an A, B, C, C, B prime, A prime, or C, C prime. It can take several different forms, but it always forms some kind of an arrow, and the central focus is the chiasm. The focus is on the central part, the point being made. Okay, now, it involves inversion in that B and B prime are parallel. They're either synonymously parallel, in other words, they're the same idea, or they can be antithetically parallel. One can be a contrast to the other. There'll be some kind of connection between the two. In my Gospels and Acts class, I've talked about this with regard to the Gospel of Matthew. And you have, in one level, you have John the Baptist being arrested. Parallel to that, in the other one, he's executed. In one, you have Jesus doing a series of miracles with discussions on discipleship. In the other one, he has focus on discipleship with occasional miracles. Mirror image kind of things. So you have these kinds of things being done through this. Now, chiasms can be seen in places like Daniel. And again, in the other class I talked about that, but I'll repeat it here for y'all. Is that the book of Daniel has a chiasm in that you've got, in Daniel chapter 2, you've got the dream of the statue, which is 4 kingdoms. And then in chapter 7, you have the dream of the beasts, which is 4 kingdoms. So you've got, on either end, the 4 kingdoms. Then, when you look at chapter 3 and chapter 6, chapter 3, you've got the fiery furnace. In chapter 6, you've got the lion's den. In both cases, God protects. And in both cases, it's His own people. God protects His own. Then, chapters 4 and 5, you have Nebuchadnezzar's madness. and you have Belshazzar's death because of the handwriting on the wall. In these two, God punishes. And so, using this structure, you see God sovereignly controls history, can protect His own, and can punish anybody He wants to. Which is one of the key themes in that section. So, this structure guides us to a central point. In John chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. In the Greek, there is a chiastic structure in those verses. And at the center of the chiasm is the statement that the Word was with God, the Word was God. A statement of Christ's deity. That He is distinct from the Father, but still identified as deity along with the Father. And it's on the basis of that statement, to a great extent, that our Trinitarian doctrine has been developed. Because that is a part of the meaning of the text as brought out by this structure. So there's a lot of chiasms in narrative literature. The Pentateuch, the 5 books of the Pentateuch, are a chiasm. That's why Exodus and Numbers are in the wilderness. The whole point of the Pentateuch is Leviticus. Leviticus. Holiness. Holy living with a holy God. And so that's seen in that structure. Well, let's go ahead and take a pause here. Let's take about a 5-minute pause.